Thank you very much for that kind introduction and good evening from a cold, wet, and windy Liverpool. I'm sure it's not like that in Sydney. And thank you also to NCRED for allowing me to speak at the start of the symposium because my days of staying up all night are way past me. I can no longer pull all-nighters. Anyway, so as per the introduction, I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we've been doing in Europe around risk communication and talking about some guidance which was published by the European Drugs Agency last year around the development of risk communication, particularly for drug checking services. But I think that this topic is also relevant for other types of intelligence and communication as well. I'll explain more as I go along. Just in terms of declarations, I don't think I have any relevant conflicts of interest, but just for transparency, a range of topics here. And so I will be talking about this guidance, and just important to acknowledge and recognize that this was done in collaboration with the European Drugs Agency and the Trans-European Drug Information Network, which is a project and a network of European community and state-based drug checking services. And this network shares expertise, understanding and knowledge from a perspective of monitoring and intelligence. And they asked me to help to put together this guidance. And just to acknowledge that the guidance was done in collaboration with those and people who use those services and people who use substances as well. The QR code there will take you to the full report. And what I'm going to try and do over the next 20 minutes or so is just to focus on some of the highlights here. I don't have time to go through all of the details because this is based on a much more comprehensive narrative review, drawing together a lot of international guidance around risk communication. But hopefully, I'll be able to highlight a few topics which will be of interest to the audience today. In terms of the nature of drug related threats, of course, these are rapidly evolving. There are many globally relevant threats. So, certainly here in the UK, over the last year or so, we've been very concerned around nitazines. And I know that that's an issue which has been affecting Australia as well. But this is also true across the whole of mainland Europe as well. Some concerning findings, some concerning intelligence, for example, about the detection of nitazines in OxyContin, buprenorphine, even. And some community-based drug checking services have found nitazines within products sold as cannabis as well. Whether that's deliberate, whether that's accidental contamination, we don't really know. But I think there is emerging evidence that a nitazene or novel opioid market, criminal market, is being established. So in the UK last year, police seized a makeshift lab that had synthesized around about 150 nitazene tablets, suggesting a deliberate production here rather than accidental. For many years, the main threat has been novel psychoactive substances, and we saw the number of detections increase year on year. Latest data from the European Drugs Agency suggests that the rate of detection is slowing after almost 10 years of yearly increases, but the amount seized has increased. In terms of other types of drugs and the threats and concerns that we have here, so down in the bottom left, you can see an alert issued by the UK charity, drug checking charity, the Loop, and this concerns MDMA pills. Now, historically, when a pill would be detected with around about 200 plus milligrams of MDMA in it, considering a usual recreational dose is about 75 to 120, that would be cause for an alert. That would be cause for concern. But charities like the Loop are now detecting high strength, harmfully high strength tablets on a regular basis, to the extent now where they're not issuing regularly alerts around these 200 milligram tablets. It has to be a really high strength tablet to issue an alert. And a very recent alert that they did, for example, the detection of an MDMA tablet with 260 milligrams, so over 4 times the regular dose. So a large range of threats, and these threats are changing as well, which really illustrates the importance of evidence based but timely risk communications, not only to people who are exposed to these drug threats as well, but also services and professionals who are responding to this. And if we think about overall strategies, particularly to emerging drug related threats, then communication plays an integral part in this. So, not only in relation to monitoring of local drug markets or national drug markets, but increasingly we're understanding the important role that community based drug checking services have in developing awareness of local drug markets and often providing a very rapid and real time response and understanding of local markets. And risk communication is essential to this, not only with regards to communication of results, but also using that data, using consultations and the opportunities for consultations in order to try and change behavior or encourage people to enact harm reduction practices as well. But risk communications also have a wider role, and it's not just about threats and these acute alerts as well. And we know from the wider risk communication and health communication literature the importance of sustained public health communications, targeting a range of stakeholders to develop awareness, to develop resilience, but also developing a trusted communicator brand. And I'll return to that in a moment. And of course, if we think back over the last 5 years and our response to COVID, the central important part of public communications there. We have a lot of learning and understanding emerging from COVID, which I think is very relevant to the drugs field as well. And part of this guidance was based on some international guidance issued around COVID, particularly from the World Health Organization. So drug risk communication has many objectives. Some of the more traditional objectives, so alerting the public about emerging drug-related threats, sharing information between stakeholders, and I'm sure you'll be hearing about many of these over the course of the day today. But drug risk communication has other important objectives as well, which I don't think we pay enough attention to. So yes, it can also be used to promote and support individual behavior change, but it can also be used to improve audiences' drug literacy, to develop resilience to future threats as well, can potentially influence attitudes towards harmful drug practice. And I think also maybe an underutilized but important activity is to foster public support for harm reduction activities. And by fostering that support, we can also signal to decision makers and funders the importance of a range of harm reduction activities. So risk communication is not just about the threat, it has a wider role as well, I think. And if we think about national strategies and frameworks for responding to drug-related deaths, and here's just a generic framework, high-level framework developed by the European Drugs Agency about the important multi-componented response, important actions that we need to take to reduce drug-related deaths. And I've highlighted in red here the roles that drug risk communications can play in all of these strategic actions. So this ranges from, of course, again, understanding local drug markets and communicating this, but also we can use communications and the relationships which are developed in our communications to empower people who use drugs, to help people to protect themselves. It can be used, of course, in prevention and early intervention, but also it's integral to outreach and low threshold services as well. So drug risk communication is important for a range of activities. That's on a national level. At a local level, and this is something I've been thinking about over the last few weeks here in Liverpool and some of our local actions in relation to the threats posed by opioids, for example. But communication is important at a community and an individual level as well. I mentioned before that we can use communications to empower individuals and communities, but we can also use it to build social networks and build social networks not just amongst communities who use drugs, but reaching out between service providers, other types of stakeholder, commissioners, etc., with those communities as well. And by doing this, we can begin to build capacity to address drug related harms, a community and grassroots response to drug related harm. And again, building that local resilience to drug related threats. And many of you might be aware of the work of Bruce Wallace and colleagues in Vancouver, the University of Vancouver, about their community drug checking services there. And he presents drug checking in its broader perspective. So he takes a social ecological perspective, and his team, through their work, they've written about and they've spoken about the fact that drug checking and associated activities, including communication, can actually be used as a useful policy device and actually mediate policies around substance use, around safer supply, generating, fostering support, help to mitigate some of those harms from criminalization and the harms which might result from criminal markets as well, but also to help to create healthier environments, to reduce stigma, to reduce trauma. Now, that is not how we usually think about communication of drug related threats, but maybe we need to expand our communications to ensure that we're not just focusing on the toxicological threat, but also about how we're going to build relationships through our communications as well. So there's three phases of communication, and this is outlined in the guidance that I mentioned before. And I'll talk about some of the key principles that we propose through this guidance in a moment. Three phases: preparedness, delivery, and then review. And we often spend a lot of our time and most of our time on delivery and perhaps don't pay enough attention to preparedness and the review and evaluating the impact of our activities. So, preparedness broadly covers understanding target audiences, developing partnerships, not just with fellow professionals, but with communities of people who use drugs and the general public, of course. Really important to develop, test, and refine communications as well. There's a lot of assumptions in the field, and I don't think we do enough testing and testing which takes into account the nuances and of risk perceptions that different audiences have. In terms of the delivery, this is where we focus most of our attention, as I mentioned. And this is the phase where we issue alerts and communications, monitor dissemination, adjust the implementation. And the purpose of delivery, as I'll mention in a moment, is to support recommended actions. And then moving on to the review phase as well to refine activities. So, as part of this guidance, and this was in collaboration with drug checking services, we tried to identify almost the top 10 tips for communication for drug checking services. The full report goes into much more detail, but these are the headlines that we think are important. And for many of the drug checking services, and I agree with this, that the key thing for all successful communication is trust and credibility from the perspective of communicators. And this is exceedingly difficult to establish and very easy to lose. I'll talk about that more in a moment. And also, we need to take into account that risk communication is a process that begins long before a drug threat emerges and an alert is issued. And this is a way, a drug communication is a way that is not just a response to an acute threat, but also a way of building resilience to future threats. And so, by this process, engaging in this process, it's almost a process of socially normalizing and developing group skills and harm reduction practices as well. And I'm not sure we pay enough attention to that. Really important during preparedness about understanding how audiences conceptualize, understand, and respond to risk and communication about risks. So, how do audiences think, feel, and communicate about drugs and the risks involved? And I'll talk about that, a bit more about that in a moment. There's also, of course, not forgetting the message design activities. We need to think about the message narrative. What story do we want to tell? The message framing, so the extent to which the consequence of a hazard or behavior are emphasized in the communication, but also message tailoring. And again, tailoring has to be done on the basis of our understanding our audiences. And if we think just about risk perception, and there's been some really interesting work done on this, not just in relation to drugs, but in terms of risk perception more generally. And we often think of the general public as rational thinking beings when it comes to risk information. But as we probably know from our own experiences during the COVID period, that's not always the case. And in fact, we respond to risk more on the basis of how we feel about that risk rather than how we think about it. So when we're developing communications, we need to take this into account. When people are faced by a threat, regardless of what that threat is, they tend not to develop their responses via a considered cognitive process. People develop so-called heuristics, rules of thumb, that they develop from their own experiences, past experiences, people who they trust around them. They don't always follow the advice that you give them. Risk perception is also modified by the ways of life that people are committed to, including politics as well. Other things which I think are important in our design are familiarity with hazards, the fact that many audiences suffer from information overload. And the World Health Organization often talks about infodemics, and infodemics being more challenging than a threat itself. When audiences are faced by information overload, we don't really know how to respond to this. And we tend to revert to these heuristics rather than paying attention to the information which has been communicated to us by drug checking services or public health services. Two other factors which I think are very important are communicator features, that trust and credibility that I mentioned before, but something equally important, the histories of engagement that communities have with different organizations as well. And again, that can be easily lost. Communities remember, they remember that history of engagement. And they also remember and understand the values and whether values of professional organizations are shared and communicated well. In terms of understanding audiences, I'm sure those of you in the audience will appreciate that audiences process and respond to threats to health and well-being in very different ways. So it's really important that we have a good understanding of our audiences in terms of settings of drug use, beliefs about drug harms, beliefs about personal susceptibility to drug-related harms as well. And when we're thinking about messages, understanding whether audiences have a perceived efficacy to respond and the suggestions that we're making in response to these threats, whether audiences believe that they have the power, the skills, the ability to respond in a way which preserves their decision making and choices, but also removes the threat. I've mentioned quite a few times trust, confidence, and credibility. So, trusted communicators, we know from communication science, not just from the drugs field, they listen to people, they respect and acknowledge the concerns of people who use drugs. And they clearly communicate through their actions, their deeds, their words, that they are committed to an audience's health and well being, and that they are predictable, fair, and consistent in their actions. And from this trust, we can begin to develop confidence. So, when an audience's investment in a trust is justified, a communicator, professional organizations don't let audiences down. And we also need to have communicators which are credible. And different types of communicators will have different credibility with different audiences, whether that's a professional audience, whether it's people who use drugs, whether that's the general public. Different communicators will have different credibility. And we know from a range of health risk behaviors that credibility might actually be more important to an audience responding to advice than a belief in the accuracy of information. So, is a communicator credible? Are they trusted? If they are, an audience is more likely to have the confidence that if they follow the recommended action, it will reduce harm because they believe that communicator has their best interests at heart. And I don't think we're always very good at doing this. In terms of the delivery phase, just a couple of things to highlight here. Uh, Many of these will be familiar to you. You know, it's not rocket science. It's these are most of these are common sense activities. But one thing I would highlight, and this is something where the balance is often tricky to achieve, that we know from health psychology and wider communication science that audiences, when we issue a communication, audiences need to feel that they're personally at risk from a drug threat but not to the extent that their fear prevents them from adopting the recommended action. Otherwise, people respond in a number of ways. They can either go into a defensive mode where they want to preserve their choice and their autonomy, and they might do this by trying to exert control over that risk, by engaging in drug use despite the threat to show that they can control it. And we have some good evidence around this. They can also go into a more fear appraisal role where rather than responding to the drug threat, people's actions, people's cognitions, for example, respond to the negative emotions that they have. And this is more about controlling fear and anxiety rather than their personal exposure to the threat. So we need to raise threat to a certain degree, but not so much that we have this unintended consequence. And we also know that positively framed messages that emphasize the benefits of adopting a recommended course of action are likely to be much more effective than those which are solely about fear arousal or negatively framed. This is not unique to drugs and drug threat communication. This is true across public health and health psychology as well. Uh, Moving on. So, in terms of key features of alerts and communications, and I know that Vicky from Public Health Scotland is going to be talking about the radar system in Scotland after I've spoken, and she'll go into this in a bit more detail. But good communications have three key features. They identify the threat, they're honest about what we know and sometimes what we don't know, and provide a recommended response. They're the key features. And this is important for all risk communications. And this is the template that the radar system uses in Scotland. So they might vary by design, the images used, the language used, the colouring, the framing, but having these three key components is really important. And this is an example from the HSE in Dublin in response to the detection of nitazines in this is an alert from June 2024, but they were first detected in Dublin and Ireland in November of last year. And this was a rare example of a national red alert. So here you can see the same features. The design's very different. What is the threat? The threat is from nitazene type opioids detected in counterfeit benzodiazepine tablets. What do we know about it? Well, we know about nitazenes, the toxicity, and we know that it's caused overdoses. And what is the recommended action? And because the threat in this case was so severe, the recommendation here was to avoid the tablets completely. The recommendation might be different for different types of drugs. Again, going back to this image that I presented at the beginning. This is from the Loop based in the United Kingdom, but we see lots of examples of communications like this across Europe, but this is an exemplar, I think. This is raising concerns about those harmfully high doses of MDMA detected in ecstasy tablets at a particular festival. Again, what is the threat? The threat is harmfully high doses. What do we know? We know that this dose is twice the common adult dose. And then what is the recommended response? And here in this communication, the response is something that people can relatively easily adopt. So it's about reducing the amount taken at a single occasion, waiting before redosing, and taking breaks. So sensible, generic harm reduction advice, but things which people can easily enact. And I've highlighted here at the bottom the Loop logo, which they include on all of their communications. In the United Kingdom, the Loop charity is a trusted brand, it's a trusted communicator, but the logo is always on there because many communications are issued via social media. And once a communication is issued via social media, you lose control. It moves beyond your control and what you intend to do. So by preserving features such as logos, you can tell the origin, and and when the communication becomes dispersed and distributed through different networks and shared through different communities, that trusted brand is still there. We also know that as with many interventions, not just communication interventions, but public health interventions, we know there's going to be a diminishing impact of communications. And this essentially means that we have few opportunities to make a difference once we once we enact the communications. Now, there might be follow-up communications with more detailed advice, talking about further understandings and intelligence that we might have, and further advice and recommendations. But our first communication is key. It's what audiences pay most attention to over and above any subsequent communications. But the impact diminishes based on risk perception, based on how communications are distributed, they lose their power. And that this diminishes from the communication being issued to audiences receiving the message, how they access it, how they understand this information, and subsequently how they act upon it. Something else that we need to keep in mind, of course, is the low levels of drug literacy and health literacy in general populations. So in Australia, for example, something we need to take into account is that 60% of people have low health literacy. So this makes it much more difficult to act upon information. And this is why many health communicators suggest that actually, when we think about risk communications, uh, the objective shouldn't necessarily be behavior change, because the probability of a communication or a single communication, because of these factors having a behavior change impact, is quite low. It should actually be more about preparedness, or signposting or referring audiences to further activity. And again, this is what we saw over the COVID period. And some of the most effective drug risk communications are signposting to other types of services. Now, of course, we need those services needs to be available through welfare and outreach, for example. And finally, we need to have a review phase. So risk communication activities should be evidence-based and evidence generating. So, with regards to checking services more generally, there's an emerging evidence base that these can lead to behavior change. We've still got a lot of work to do, and we need better designed studies to really establish the effectiveness of drug checking services. But even saying that, probably our evidence around the effectiveness of risk communication activities is even weaker than that. And I think sometimes there's the risk that issuing alerts or communications can almost become a ritualistic exercise without having this evidence generating component. So how do we go about doing this? Just mindful of time, so I won't spend too long on the research side of things. This is of interest to me as a researcher, so I've been thinking about this a lot, but I appreciate that this won't be of interest to everybody in the audience today. We know from work into mass media interventions that communication components in and of themselves probably have very little impact on health behaviors, health risk behaviors, regardless of what that behavior is, but certainly substance use. They're most effective when they're delivered alongside a wider system of support. We can't expect the communication to lead to these desired behavior change objectives, or reducing drug related harms need to be delivered and understood alongside a whole system of support. So this in the guidance we presented a theory of change about how we thought risk communications might work. But the important thing to note is that these haven't been tested yet. So for the researchers in the audience, this is a big challenge, and hopefully we can begin to do some work on this. And we know from wider work in the public health fields that uh, systems, particularly at the community level, can be very complicated with many different factors and feedback systems and unexpected and unintended consequences. But we need to start to theorize how our risk communications and our responses to threats fit within this wider health and social system that we're releasing them into. And I think only then can we begin to have a good understanding about what the impact might be. In terms of evidence gaps, the World Health Organization, when it was emerging from COVID, when it was doing its review phases and thinking about the next threats, and then we had monkeypox, for example, developed some really good guidance, and particularly around what were some of the research gaps. And again, this is an appeal to researchers in the audience. First of all, I've already mentioned, what is the positive impact of risk communication? Again, the evidence is quite weak and sparse there. How do we adapt our designs to account for differences in risk perception? How are new norms created? So we theorize that we can create healthier norms around harm reduction and prevention and intervention through communications. And that's certainly from practical experience, we think that's the case. But what are the mechanisms and how do we build upon this? And how do we actually communicate uncertainty as well? This is particularly relevant to think about rapidly changing and dynamic drug markets when we don't always have the information about what the threats are and what the potential consequences are. But we know from the background literature on risk communication that audiences appreciate acknowledging uncertainty as well. And some approaches as well can have unintended and unexpected consequences. And when I was thinking of this, I was mindful. I was very lucky to attend the Lisbon Addictions Conference last month, and I know there was good representation from Australia at that conference. And there was a special session on the threat posed by novel synthetic opioids. And Dr. Eamon Keenan from the HSE in Dublin, and I showed you some of their alerts before, he was talking about the comprehensive response to nitazines in Dublin as a response to those overdose clusters. They issued that red alert, and with regards to the response to Dublin in terms of resolving future overdoses, that was effective. They were reduced. It was a whole city response. But what they later found a few weeks later was that the neighboring city of Cork also began to experience a cluster of overdoses. And this was related to nitazines as well. And they're doing further work on this, but he suggested in his talk that this might have been an unintended consequence of a successful risk communication in Dublin. Because speaking to people who purchase drugs, who use drugs, they were suggesting, and this needs further work, that when the risk communications and other work was issued in Dublin, drug sellers shifted their stock to Cork. So we need to think about some of these unintended and unexpected consequences. And I'm also mindful of earlier work done in Canada in earlier phases of their opioid crisis, where very well intentioned communications from the police around high strength opioids at the time, and again, this was well intentioned, led to people seeking out those high strength opioids because they were perceived to represent good value for money. So our communications can have unexpected consequences. Okay, that's a very much a whistle stop tour. Hopefully, I've given you a flavour of what's in the guidance. I'm very happy to take questions now and to continue the conversation, whether that's on social media or email, and very happy to send you the guidance as well and some of the background documents as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Harry, and thank you for sharing your email and making that available to people if they have follow-up questions that we don't have time for today. Is there anyone in the audience that has a question? We've got a roaming mic. Any hands up? No? Okay. And are questions just in here as well? Okay, lovely. Well, that keeps it nice and short and sweet. And thank you so much for that incredibly fascinating and relevant presentation. Thank you.